Hey guys, Jim here and welcome to Budget RC. Today I'm kicking off a 3-part video series on how to assemble and install Redcat's new Portal Axles designed for the Gen 7 crawler. So stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. And like I said in the intro, we've got a set of Redcat's new Portal Axles. And I'm going to do a 3-part video series on taking you through the assembly of the axles in the first video. In the second video, we'll do the installation into the vehicle. And in the third vehicle, I'll address some of the problems I ran into in the second part and show you how I'm going to fix them. In this video, I'm going to show you how to assemble both the front and the rear axles. So let's get started. So this is the bag that everything comes in. And what we're going to do is lay out all the bags and follow the instructions that are right on the Redcat website. In this bag is a parts list. And all of the parts themselves are bagged up. No instructions come with the kit. However, right on the bag here is the location of the website so that you can download a PDF copy of the instructions. I have those up on my laptop right here, and I'll be following those as we go. There are 7 bags. The instructions are starting us with bag 1, which is the right front assembly. So one thing I noticed right away is that even though the individual bags within bag 1 are labeled 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, you're kind of grabbing pieces from each. These 2 parts right here came from bag B, and this little pin, which is the 10mm pin, came from bag D. Now make sure you pay attention because there is a 12mm pin in that same bag, and that's not what you want to use right now. So the first step is going to be insert this pin into the back hole. And now you're going to slide the larger gear on like that. So next we're going to open up our other 2 bags because we need one of the small bearings out of bag D, and out of bag A we need the right side housing. So now we're going to put our bearing right down in there. Now we can take this gear and make sure you're holding it from the back. You want to be applying some pressure so that that pin doesn't fall out. That gear will fit right in there. All right, so next we're going to assemble the CV axle. So for this you'll need the shaft, you'll need the coupler, you're going to need the pin, and you're going to need the shaft output. Now keep in mind this is the 12mm pin out of the kit, not the 10mm. I'm going to take this piece, slide it in. Right now I've got the hole facing straight up. Now I can take my CV shaft, put the pin right through the whole assembly, give it a turn. Now what you'll do is take your large bearing and slide the large bearing on. The large bearing is what captures that pin, just like this. Now we go back to our assembly that we had just put the gear into, and this CV axle is going to slide in from the other side. There you go. So the next step is to take 3 of these little tiny button head screws. They're 2mm by 4mm in length. And they're going to screw in to the back here, and that's what holds the bearing in place. Don't over tighten these. These are real small screws in a real small hole, and it won't take any force to strip that hole. You just want to get these in until they sit flush. It appears that their only purpose is to hold this bearing into place, so they really don't need to be in there tight. So now we'll take the small gear. So one thing you want to pay attention to with this small 8-tooth gear is that if you look right here, there's a little bit of a lip on one side. On the other side, it's completely flat. You want to have that flat side go down when you install. That way you can still see the lip once it's installed. And there you go. Now we have the outer cover, which is going to require the last 2 bearings to be installed into it. Get the bearings in, get them seated down. So before we put this cover on, we're going to want to make sure and we grease these up real well. I'm using good old axle bearing grease because I have a ton of it around and it's cheap. If you want to use some fancy grease from an RC brand, by all means knock yourself out. You don't need a ton of this stuff, but you do want to make sure that your gears are well coated, especially if you're going to be using this stuff in water. I tend not to run my RCs in a lot of water. So now we can slide this right over. Make sure it's clamped. Everything's still working nice and free. Now we can put our screws in. For this, you're going to be using 6 of these 2mm by 6mm screws. So start all 6 screws. Make sure that they're all going in nice and straight. And before you snug it down, make sure things are still nice and free. Then you go ahead and snug them down easily. And again, just like with the other piece, you just want to go until you feel a little bit of resistance. You don't want to crank on these too hard. This is real small hardware, and it will not be difficult to strip. Everything's tight. Everything still works nice and free. So the next step is to install our wheel hex. We're going to use that last 10mm pin that was in the kit. Slide that hex over. There you go. So next you can set this aside along with the remaining parts that are still left over from bag 1. And you can move on to bag 2, which is going to be the left side front. It'll go together the same way this one did. All right, so next up we dig into bag 3. And for the first step of the center axle assembly, you're going to want the housing itself. You're going to want the small 10mm bearing and the 11mm bearing. First thing we're going to do is install the bearings. Small one goes on the outside, and the larger one goes down there on the inside. Now we're going to put our pinion together. So for the pinion, this is going to slide right over, and it's going to be held in place by this little tiny 2mm countersunk screw. Make sure you're using the countersunk style screw and not one of the flat heads or pan heads. This is a metal screw into metal threads, so you want to make sure that you're using your medium strength thread locker here. Just a reminder, you don't want the high strength stuff because you'll never be able to get it apart. Now once you screw this in, make sure it's good and snug. And now this can slide right down into your axle. Make sure it spins nice and freely. So next we want to install the spool into the ring gear. And to do this, we're going to use 4 more of those countersink screws, just like we used to hold the pinion onto the shaft. And just like last time, you do want to make sure that you use thread lock on these as well. So this ring gear is going to install on the short side of the spool, and you'll install your screws from the back side. So as usual, I recommend that you get all 4 installed loosely. Make sure that the ring gear is seated properly on the spool. Once you've got that thing to where you're happy with the fit, go ahead and snug the rest of them up, and you're good to go. Now we can slide our bearings on. Now don't force the bearings. If they're a little bit crooked, they're not going to slide on right. If you've got them nice and straight, they'll slide right on. So now for your next step, you want to put your ring and your spool into the housing. Of course, we want to get this nice and greased up again. Of course, we want to get this all greased up before we install it. Now, if you guys are going to run your axles in really wet environments, some people prefer to pack the whole diff assembly completely full of grease to help keep water out. Now, although I don't necessarily avoid water, I don't go looking for it either. So I'm going to put a nice liberal coating on here, but I'm not going to pack the housing full of grease. So now this should be able to slide right down into here. And I should be able to turn my input shaft, and everything rotates nicely. Now, unlike with the axial axles, there are not any caps to hold this down. This snazzy aluminum diff cover has the bearing retainers built right in. So this is going to install over it, and then you can use your mounting hardware to close it up. The screws for this cover are a little 2mm screw. You should have 6 of them in your kit. You don't need thread lock on these because these are going into plastic. As usual, get them all installed loosely. Then you can go back, snug things up. These are going into plastic, so you do not want to over tighten. Make sure everything still works nice and smooth. So here it is all assembled. Once you get all the screws tightened up, make sure you give this a turn, and it should turn pretty smoothly. There might be a little bit of notchiness to it, but it shouldn't be real notchy. The first time I put it together, it was a little bit too notchy. So I took it back apart. I made sure that the pinion was fully seated and that the pinion bearing was seated properly. Put it back together, and now there's still a little bit of notchiness, but for the most part it feels pretty good. So now you're going to go back to bag 1. You're going to grab your C-mount, and you're going to get your link ball, and you're going to install these. Take your 2.5mm driver, and this will go right into this hole here. Now we'll go back to bag 2, do the same thing for the other side. Once you have that link stud on there, now you can take your right side piece from bag 1 and you're going to install it on the long side of your axle assembly. Once that's put on, you're going to use 3 of these really long, skinny 2mm screws to attach it to the housing. I found that these are a little bit tough to get started, so when you get them started, you just want to make sure that you're pushing with enough force so that they're going into the holes in the axle housing, and then you'll feel them and you'll see them start pulling in. As you can see, I'm only just getting them started before I move on to the next one. Now I've got the third one, they're all started. Now I can carefully drive them home, again making sure not to over tighten. So once you've got that C-hub tightened and installed, now you can take these little bushings, slide them into the top and the bottom of the C-hub. Now you can take your axle assembly, slide the axle shaft down. You may have to turn your input shaft a little bit. Once everything lines up, you should see the whole assembly turn. Now you can take M3 screws, which should be your last 2 screws from your bag 1. You install them top and bottom to secure your knuckle to your C-hub. Once they're snug, this should still work pretty smoothly. If that feels like it's got too much resistance, just back off a hair on these, and now it should work pretty free. If there's too much resistance here, you can put undue stress on your servo. So now we're looking pretty good. And that'll work its way loose after a while also. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So the next step is to install these lower link mounts. These are going to mount right onto here on the axle, and you've got both sides. These are held on by these 3mm screws. Should be a total of 4 in bag 3. So once they're installed, they should look like this. All right, so now we're going to install our rod end. So the first thing we want to do is take and put these ball studs into the end links. Now the way I like to do it is to take my driver, put it through the hole. Now in most cases you can just push these down, but these seem to be really tight and I'm not able to. So I'm going to just take a small pair of pliers and use that to help me push it down on. Once it's installed, you're set to go. Just take your grub screw, use your 1.5mm driver, and you want to install it into the end link. Now you don't want to go into the aluminum rod, for the reason being you want as much of this grub screw into the plastic as you can. And if you bury it into the aluminum rod, you're going to end up with most of the threads in the rod instead of in the plastic part. The reason that you want to run it into the plastic, this will give the plastic more strength. So now, once this starts getting a little tight, go ahead and put one of your other drivers through there. That way you can keep driving this one home. Once that's all the way in, now you should be able to just thread it right into here. And we can do the same thing on the other side. Now instead of using Loctite like I would usually recommend when you're installing metal screws into a metal piece, you actually want to use a little bit of grease on these threads. The reason for this, when you try to remove things, you're not going to be able to get it back out of the metal link because the end for your driver will be buried down inside of the link. So by doing it this way with a little bit of grease, that'll help prevent galvanic corrosion, so you'll be able to get these apart later if you need to. Once this is installed on your vehicle, these can't turn anyway, so you don't have to worry about it loosening back up. Now we're going to install this panhard link that we just created to the axle. For this we're going to use M3 by 14mm screws. Now one thing I noticed is that a lot of these screw holes in this kit are chamfered, which really helps make it a lot easier to get these screws started. It's really a nice touch. Even though the instructions want you to mount it right now, what I'm going to do is just bury the screw into here so we don't lose it. And I will install it after it's on the truck. This is going to be a lot easier to install on the truck if you don't have the axle hanging off of it. So congratulations guys, you've now got your front axle assembly completely assembled. So now we'll move on to the rear axle assembly, which is going to be really similar to this, except hopefully a whole lot simpler because you don't have your steering components to deal with. So I'll take you through the parts of that installation that are unique compared to the front. But for the center section, you'll be able to follow the same instructions that we already did for the front. So let's move on to the rear. Okay guys, so now we're going to start with the rear. So on the back side, unlike the front, what you really want to start with is the center section itself. Now the assembly of the center section is exactly the same as the front, so I didn't take you through that. Once your center section is done, once your center section is complete, now you can take your portals, you can install your studs just like on the front, and now your portals are going to install onto the axle housing assembly just like the front. Now one thing you want to be aware of is that unlike in the front where you had a lot of access to these 3 screws that hold the portal to the axle, on the rear they're buried pretty far in there. You can see how far I'm sticking my driver in. Because of that, you really can't see what you're doing, so you can't rely on visual cues to know when it's tight. You really need to pay attention, and as soon as you start feeling it get snug, stop turning the screw. Okay, once those portals are installed, now you want to put your bearings in. So your smallest bearing is going to go on the bottom here. So your other bearing goes into the upper area. You want to try to get it somewhat into place and then push it home till it's firmly seated and not crooked. Do the same thing on the other side. So next are these. These work just like the front did. Big gear on. You get both of those done. Now what you're going to want to do is put them aside and install your axles. Now on your axles, the large end goes in, and of course you've got 2 different sizes here. So make sure long goes to long and short goes to short. Turn your pinion a little bit as you're pushing on the axle. Once things line up, that'll go all the way in. So now we'll do it to the other side. Now you can take this part here, which assembles just like the front. This is going to sit just like that. Now this gear here, just like on the front, you want the little lip facing out and can install on the top. Before I put it in, I'm going to get my grease on things because I think it's going to be a little bit easier now than after it's installed. There, we're all good and greasy. This can go on the top. Turn things till they align. Now you should be able to turn your pinion, get that grease on everything. So now we want to take 2 more bearings and install them in the cover. And now your cover can install over your gears. And again, before you tighten it up, make sure everything turns. This one's working well. So now we're just going to go put those 6 2mm screws in just like we did on the front. Okay guys, once you get both sides together, it should look pretty much like this. Give your pinion a turn, make sure everything works. And now we can put our suspension mounts onto the rear axle. And this works just like the front. The only difference is that with the rear, there's no panhard mount, so both sides are the same. So we're going to use our screws, go ahead and put this on. Okay guys, well that's it for the rear axle. So now we can move it aside. We'll open bag 6 and we'll move on to the linkage assembly. So I've got it laid out the way it's going to go here. Okay guys, when you get to your steering link, this little stud that goes into your link is got left-handed thread on one side and normal right-handed thread on the other. And that's designed so that when you turn this thing, you can change the length. Because of that, only one side will thread into your steering link. So you want to make sure that you do that first. Make sure you figure out which side threads in. And then you can just go ahead and send it home. My nut driver won't fit over the shaft, so I'm going to just use a pair of pliers. And again, I'm not using thread locker because once this thing's installed, it's not going to go anywhere. Nothing's going to loosen up. So once you've got that end in, I wasn't able to get it in all the way. Hopefully that's by design. And like I said, this here is a left-handed thread, so you're going to want to tighten this one backwards into here. Go ahead and tighten that down. Again, I'm going to leave it a little bit loose. Now you can continue with your installation on the other side, which should be pretty straightforward. Just like we've done before. We're going to bury this into the plastic. Once that's snugged down, slag a little bit of grease on it, and we can install into the other end of the steering link. So once that's done, what we want to do is put one of our 3mm screws through here, and we're going to snug that screw into the steering link. So once you've got this all installed, you do want to make sure that this is clocked in a way where you've got this bow here and you've got this piece on the outside of that bow. And then on this side, you just want to make sure you've got this flange for the ball stud down. Then you should be all set. Okay guys, well that's it for this video. We've managed to get our rear axle, our front axle, and our steering linkage assembled. Make sure you stick around for my very next video where we install this into the Gen 7. Thanks guys.